Amara, what are you doing here and whose child are you carrying?
Daniel, I can explain.
Daniel Wexford had rehearsed this night in his mind 100 times, and in every version, it felt like victory. He never once imagined it would end with him standing frozen in the middle of his own engagement party, watching a woman he thought he'd buried in his past walk toward him carrying a tray of champagne glasses and a secret that would tear his entire world apart. Her hands trembled. Her eyes met his for less than 2 seconds. And in that moment, 5 years of silence collapsed into a single, unbearable question he was terrified to ask out loud. Was that her stomach, rounded and full, or was his mind playing the cruelest trick a man could imagine on the night he was supposed to promise himself to someone else forever? Nobody at that party noticed it yet. Not his father, raising a glass across the room. Not his fiancée, laughing with her bridesmaids near the fountain. Only Daniel saw it, and only Daniel understood, in that frozen second, that the woman serving drinks at his engagement celebration was Amara Bellwether, the wife he had signed away in a courtroom 5 years earlier, believing every word his father told him about who she really was. He had spent 5 years telling himself he'd made the right decision. Standing there now, glass shaking in his hand, he realized he had never once let himself imagine what would happen if she walked back into his life, carrying proof that everything he believed about their ending had been a lie. Before we go further into what happened next, we need to ask 3 questions that will follow us through every single moment of tonight's story. First, why did Amara really disappear 5 years ago? And was it truly her choice, or was she forced out of a marriage she never wanted to leave? Second, whose child is she carrying tonight, and why did she choose the one night guaranteed to destroy Daniel's new engagement to reveal it? Third, and perhaps most disturbing of all, did anyone else in that room already know the truth long before Daniel did? And if so, how long had they been lying to his face while smiling at his side? To understand how a millionaire ended up frozen in shock at his own party, we have to go back nearly a decade to a much younger Daniel Wexford, before the wealth, before the empire, before his name meant anything to anyone outside of a small circle of family and friends. He was 24, working long hours at his father's struggling construction firm, driving a car with over 190,000 miles on it, and dreaming about a future he wasn't sure he'd ever reach. Amara worked 2 counters down from the coffee shop, where he stopped every morning before work, and for months, neither of them said more than a passing hello. It was Amara who finally broke the silence, teasing him one morning about ordering the same black coffee every single day, like a man afraid of change. He laughed harder than he had in weeks. Within 6 months, they were inseparable, and within 2 years, they were married in a small backyard ceremony neither of their families could really afford, surrounded by the kind of joy that money has never been able to manufacture. Daniel would later tell people that those were the only years of his life he never once had to pretend to be happy. Everything after that, he admitted privately, felt like performance. His father, Marcus Wexford, never approved of Amara. He believed she had nothing to offer his son beyond affection, and affection, in Marcus's mind, built nothing. When Daniel's small investments in local property began multiplying faster than anyone expected, Marcus saw an opportunity to reshape his son's future entirely, and he made it his mission to remove anything from that future he considered a liability. Amara, in his eyes, was the first thing that needed to go. He never said it directly to Daniel. Instead, he worked quietly, patiently, and with the kind of calculated precision that built entire fortunes from nothing. Amara noticed the change before Daniel ever did. Dinners canceled for meetings that mysteriously appeared on his calendar. Phone calls that used to last an hour shortened to 2 minutes. Weekends that once belonged entirely to each other slowly filled with obligations neither of them had agreed to together. She tried to talk to him about it more than once, and each time, Daniel promised her it was temporary, that the business needed him now more than it would later, that soon they would have all the time in the world. She wanted to believe him. For a while she did. What Daniel never knew, and what this story will eventually force him to confront, is that his father had already begun laying the groundwork for Amara's exit long before either of them saw it coming. Marcus had quietly gathered financial leverage over Amara's family's small bakery, the one debt that could bury them if called in at the wrong time. He held that leverage the way a man holds a loaded weapon he hopes he'll never have to fire, waiting only for the right moment to force a decision that would look, to everyone watching, like Amara's choice and no one else's. That moment came faster than Marcus expected. Daniel's company won its first major contract, doubling their revenue overnight and pulling him fully into his father's orbit for the first time. Late nights turned into overnight trips. Overnight trips turned into weeks. And somewhere in the middle of that transformation, Marcus made his move, presenting Amara with a decision so carefully engineered that she believed, for years afterward, that she had chosen it entirely on her own. Before we get into exactly what he told her, and what she gave up to protect the people she loved, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus arrived at Amara's family bakery on a Tuesday morning, dressed the way he always dressed when he wanted to remind people exactly who held the power in a room. He didn't raise his voice, he never needed to. He simply laid out the numbers in front of Amara's father, the outstanding loan balance, the missed payments, the timeline before the bank would legally seize the building that had been in their family for 2 generations. Then he told Amara, privately, that all of it could disappear, quietly and permanently, if she agreed to walk away from Daniel before his career expanded any further and made an eventual separation more complicated and more public. Amara refused at first. She told Marcus she loved his son, that nothing about their marriage was a transaction to be negotiated, and that she would fight for her family's bakery through legitimate means if it came to that. Marcus simply smiled, the way men like him always smile when they already know the outcome of a conversation before it begins. He reminded her that Daniel's ambition would only grow, that his father's influence over that ambition would only deepen, and that the life she imagined for herself inside that world would eventually crush her anyway, slowly, publicly, and without any of the mercy she still believed her husband was capable of. What finally broke her resolve wasn't the money or the bakery at all. It was a single sentence Marcus said as he was leaving, almost as an afterthought, the kind of comment cruel men deliver precisely because they know its weight will linger long after they've walked out the door. He told her that if she truly loved Daniel, she would understand that his future had no room left for a woman without money, without status, and without the kind of family behind her that could protect him, instead of becoming another problem he'd eventually be forced to solve. Amara sat alone in that bakery for hours after he left, staring at numbers that weren't really about numbers at all. She discovered she was pregnant 3 weeks after that conversation, alone in a clinic waiting room, holding a piece of paper that changed everything, and told absolutely no one. She told herself she would find the right moment to tell Daniel, once things settled, once his schedule opened, once she found the version of him that still had space for the life they built together in that small backyard ceremony years earlier. That moment never came. Marcus made certain of it, accelerating his pressure campaign, planting doubts in Daniel's mind about her loyalty, arranging carefully staged sightings and half-truths designed to make an ordinary woman look like someone hiding a betrayal she never committed. Daniel received the divorce papers on a Thursday evening, delivered not by Amara herself, but by a courier hired through his father's office. He would tell people for years afterward that Amara left him for someone else, a story his father had constructed so thoroughly that Daniel repeated it to himself long after any reasonable person would have started asking harder questions. He signed the papers in a daze, told himself it was the mature decision, the necessary decision, and buried the entire relationship in the same drawer where he kept things he refused to examine too closely. Amara left the city 2 weeks later with 2 suitcases, a folder of medical paperwork, and a secret she would carry alone for the next 5 years. 5 years passed, and in those 5 years, Daniel Wexford became a different man than the one Amara Bellwether had married in that small backyard ceremony. His father's company expanded into 3 states, then 5, then into a national real estate portfolio worth more than either of them had dreamed possible during those early mornings at the coffee shop. Daniel told himself the emptiness he felt at the center of all that success was simply the price of ambition, the trade-off every serious man eventually made. He rarely let himself think about Amara at all, and when he did, he reached for the story his father had given him years earlier, the one about betrayal, about a woman who couldn't handle the life he was building. It was easier than the truth. It always had been. He met Vanessa Cole at a charity gala 18 months earlier, introduced by his father with the kind of enthusiasm Marcus reserved only for decisions he had personally engineered. Vanessa was polished, ambitious, and fluent in the exact language Marcus valued most, the language of appearances, alliances, and strategic advancement. Daniel convinced himself he loved her, and in many ways, he did, in the careful, guarded way a man loves when he has already decided love is a transaction he can control. Marcus approved of Vanessa completely, and for the first time since the divorce, father and son moved through the world in perfect alignment, each one certain they had finally built something that would last. The engagement celebration was Marcus's idea before it was Daniel's, staged at the same estate where the family hosted its most important business functions, the kind of event designed as much for photographs and headlines as for love. 300 guests filled the gardens that evening, caterers moving in practiced silence between clusters of investors, socialites and old family friends, who had watched Daniel grow from a struggling young man into the empire he now represented. Nobody in that garden knew that one of the caterers assigned to work the reception that night had once worn Daniel's last name, had once shared his bed, and had once carried a secret out of that family's reach 5 years earlier. A secret she was still carrying tonight, visibly, undeniably, in the curve of her stomach beneath her uniform. Amara had taken the catering job 3 days earlier, desperate after losing steady work, when her pregnancy became too visible to hide from employers unwilling to accommodate her condition. She had no idea whose engagement she had been assigned to work until she arrived at the estate that afternoon and saw the family crest stitched into the linens, the same crest that used to sit on stationery in a house she once called home. She considered leaving immediately. She needed the money too badly to walk away, and some quiet, aching part of her, the part she refused to examine too closely, wondered if some larger force had arranged this collision on purpose, forcing a reckoning she had spent 5 years avoiding. For the first 2 hours of the party, she managed to stay out of Daniel's line of sight entirely, moving along the edges of the garden, refilling glasses, clearing plates, keeping her head down the way 5 years of hard lessons had taught her to do. Her hands shook every time she came within 30 feet of him, terrified that a single glance would undo the fragile stability she had built for herself and the child she was carrying. She told herself she only needed to survive 1 more hour, collect her pay, and disappear from his life a second time before he ever knew she had been standing in the same garden as his new fiancée. That plan fell apart the moment Daniel turned toward the fountain to signal a toast, and found himself looking directly into the eyes of a woman he had spent 5 years trying to forget. Time did something strange in that instant, the way people describe it doing during accidents, weddings, and funerals. The 3 moments in life that seemed to slow reality down just enough to notice every detail at once. He noticed her face first, thinner than he remembered, older in a way that had nothing to do with age. Then his eyes moved lower, and the champagne glass in his hand nearly slipped from his fingers entirely. Vanessa noticed his silence before she noticed the cause of it, glancing over with the practiced smile of a woman used to sharing a room with distractions that were never quite hers to control. She followed his gaze toward the caterers near the fountain and saw nothing unusual at first, only staff moving through their duties, the way staff always did at events like this. She had no idea that the pregnant woman refilling glasses 40 feet away had once occupied the exact position she now believed was hers permanently, and she had no idea how much that ignorance was about to cost her before the night was over. Daniel excused himself from the toast with a line about needing air, a line so unlike him that even his father paused mid-sentence to watch him walk away. He found Amara near the far end of the garden, away from the crowd, standing perfectly still, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment, despite every part of her that had hoped to avoid it entirely. Neither of them spoke for what felt like an unbearably long time. When he finally did, his voice came out lower and rougher than he intended, barely more than a whisper. "Amara, what are you doing here? And whose child are you carrying?" She didn't answer immediately. 5 years of rehearsed silence didn't disappear simply because the man she'd built that silence around was suddenly standing in front of her, close enough to touch, close enough to see the exact same fear in his eyes that she remembered from the night everything ended. She set the tray down carefully on a nearby table, buying herself a few extra seconds she desperately needed. And when she finally looked up at him, her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. "I didn't come here to find you, Daniel. I came here because I needed the work. I didn't know this was your engagement until I saw the family name on the linens this afternoon." Daniel's mind raced through the timeline without meaning to. The divorce, the 5 years, the pregnancy visibly advanced enough that the math felt impossible to avoid, even as every instinct in him fought against the conclusion forming in his head. He asked her directly, his voice cracking slightly on the second half of the question, whether the child she was carrying could possibly be his. Amara's expression shifted into something Daniel hadn't seen from her since the earliest days of their marriage. A mixture of exhaustion and defiance that told him this conversation was going to reveal far more than either of them had prepared for tonight. She said 5 words that would replay in his mind for the rest of the evening. "Ask your father the truth." Before Daniel could press her further, a familiar voice called his name from across the garden, sharp enough to cut through the noise of the party behind them. Vanessa had followed him, and standing 20 feet away with her arms crossed and her expression hardening by the second, she looked directly at Amara with an unmistakable flicker of recognition. The kind of recognition that comes only from having seen a face before, not tonight, but somewhere long before this party ever began. Amara froze. Daniel noticed the exchange between the two women immediately, and for the first time all evening, a second question began forming in his mind. One that felt almost as urgent as the first. How did Vanessa already know exactly who Amara was? Vanessa's silence lasted only a few seconds. But to Daniel, standing between two women who both seemed to know something he didn't, those seconds stretched out unbearably. She recovered quickly, forcing a tight smile onto her face and insisting she simply recognized the caterer from an event months earlier, nothing more than that. Amara said nothing, watching Vanessa with an expression that made it clear she knew exactly how thin that explanation was. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a suspicion he couldn't yet name. The uncomfortable sense that the woman he was about to marry had just lied to him in front of 200 witnesses without so much as a flicker of hesitation. He asked Vanessa directly, his voice low enough that only the 3 of them could hear it, how long she had actually known about Amara. Vanessa's composure cracked slightly at the question, and for the first time that evening, Daniel saw something underneath the polish his father had always admired in her, something closer to fear. She told him this wasn't the time or the place, that they had guests waiting, that whatever was happening could be discussed privately later, away from the party his father had spent months planning. Daniel didn't move. Amara didn't move. And somewhere behind them, close enough to have heard every word, Marcus Wexford had already begun walking toward the 3 of them. Marcus arrived the way he always arrived at moments of crisis, calm, controlled, and already 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the conversation. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and suggested, in a tone meant to sound reasonable to anyone watching from a distance, that they continue this conversation somewhere private. Daniel shrugged the hand off, something he had never once done to his father in his adult life, and told him he wasn't moving until someone in this garden explained why his fiancée had just lied about knowing his ex-wife. Marcus's expression barely changed, but Amara, watching closely, recognized the particular stillness that always preceded one of his more calculated maneuvers. It was Amara who spoke next, her voice steady despite the tremor Daniel could still see in her hands. She told him that if he truly wanted the truth, he should ask his father why a courier delivered divorce papers to their apartment 5 years earlier, without her ever having signed anything voluntarily beforehand. She told him about the bakery, about the outstanding loan Marcus had quietly acquired, about the ultimatum delivered over a folder of numbers on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She told him she had been pregnant before she ever left, and that she had spent 5 years raising that fear alone, rather than let his father destroy her family's business, as payment for a marriage he'd never approved of. Daniel turned to his father with an expression none of the guests nearby had ever seen on his face before, something between disbelief and a slower, more dangerous kind of understanding. Marcus didn't deny it outright. Instead, he offered the explanation he had clearly prepared years in advance for exactly this scenario, insisting that everything he did had been necessary, that Amara would have eventually become a liability to everything Daniel was building, and that a man in Daniel's position couldn't afford sentiment getting in the way of legacy. He said the word legacy the way he always said it, like it justified anything built beneath it, no matter how many people it required stepping over along the way. Vanessa, sensing the ground shifting beneath her own position, made the mistake of trying to redirect the conversation back toward damage control, suggesting they move inside before any of the guests noticed the tension building near the fountain. Daniel turned to her instead of his father and asked the question a second time, more forcefully now, demanding to know exactly how long she had known about Amara's existence. Vanessa hesitated just long enough to answer the question without saying a word. Then, quietly, she admitted that Marcus had told her everything over a year earlier, before their relationship had even become serious, as part of what he called making sure she understood the family she was marrying into. The admission landed harder than anything else said that evening. Daniel realized that his engagement, the relationship he believed he had built on his own terms for the first time since the divorce, had been shaped by his father's hand from the very beginning, with Vanessa's full knowledge and quiet cooperation. She hadn't been deceived alongside him. She had been briefed, prepared, and folded into the same machinery that had removed Amara from his life 5 years earlier, and she had accepted that arrangement in exchange for the life it promised her. Daniel stepped back from both of them, guests nearby now openly staring, the celebration behind them continuing obliviously, while its central purpose quietly collapsed. Amara, watching Daniel absorb the full weight of what he'd just learned, felt something she hadn't expected to feel standing in that garden tonight. A fragile, cautious relief that the truth was finally being spoken aloud after 5 years of carrying it entirely alone. She hadn't come to the estate to destroy his engagement. She hadn't even known whose engagement she was working until hours earlier. But standing there now, watching Marcus's carefully constructed story fall apart in real time, she allowed herself, for the first time in years, to imagine what it might mean for Daniel to finally see his father clearly, and to finally ask the one question she had been too afraid to raise herself. Daniel turned back to Amara, his voice quieter now, stripped of the anger that had carried the last several minutes of conversation. He asked her again, more gently this time, whether the child she was carrying was his. Amara held his gaze for a long moment before answering, aware that whatever she said next would determine everything that happened for the rest of the night, and likely for the rest of both of their lives. Behind them, Marcus had gone very still, and Vanessa had taken a step back from the two of them entirely, as though some instinct told her she no longer belonged inside whatever was about to happen next. Amara took a slow breath before answering, aware that every word she chose next would follow her long after this party ended. She told Daniel that yes, the child she was carrying was his, conceived in the final weeks before the divorce papers arrived, before she had any idea their marriage was already being dismantled by someone other than either of them. She told him she hadn't kept it from him out of cruelty or revenge, but because by the time she discovered the pregnancy, she no longer believed he would choose her over the life his father had already begun building around him. Daniel stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of 5 years he could never get back. The garden around them had grown noticeably quieter, guests near the fountain sensing that something significant was unfolding, even if most of them couldn't hear the details. Daniel finally turned to face his father directly, his voice steady now in a way it hadn't been since this entire confrontation began. He asked Marcus how he could have manufactured an entire narrative about betrayal, watched his son grieve a marriage that had never actually failed on its own, and then calmly orchestrated a second engagement built on the same foundation of lies, all while allowing him to believe every decision along the way had been his own. Marcus didn't flinch, not visibly, though something in his posture shifted slightly under the weight of his son's stare. He told Daniel that everything he'd done had protected him from a life that would have limited his potential, that Amara had never fit the image of a partner capable of standing beside the empire they were building together, and that sentiment, however genuine, had no place in decisions of this magnitude. He said it plainly, without apology, the same way he had justified every calculated move throughout his career, expecting Daniel to eventually understand the logic the way he always had before. This time, Daniel didn't nod along. Instead, Daniel removed the ring box from his jacket pocket, the one he'd planned to formally present to Vanessa later that evening in front of both families, and set it down on the stone ledge beside the fountain. He told Vanessa, quietly but firmly, that he couldn't marry someone who had learned the truth about his life a year earlier and chosen silence over honesty simply because the arrangement benefited her long-term position. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, seeming to understand, perhaps for the first time, that no explanation she offered now would undo the choice she had already made months earlier when Marcus first briefed her. The guests who had gathered near enough to witness the unraveling watched in stunned silence as Daniel announced, loudly enough now for much of the garden to hear, that tonight's engagement celebration was over. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried the kind of finality that silenced even the string quartet still playing near the terrace, the musicians slowly realizing something had gone deeply wrong at the party they'd been hired to accompany. Marcus stepped forward once more, attempting to regain control of a situation rapidly slipping beyond his influence, but Daniel raised a hand and told him, for the first time in either of their lives, that this conversation was finished. He turned back to Amara, guests still watching, phones already beginning to appear discreetly among the crowd, capturing a moment that would circulate long before the night was over. He asked her, gently this time, whether she would be willing to sit down with him privately, away from his father, away from Vanessa, away from every audience that had ever influenced the decisions shaping their relationship from the beginning. Amara hesitated, uncertain whether 5 years of careful self-protection could simply be set aside because a single evening had finally revealed the truth she'd been carrying alone. But something in his voice, stripped entirely of the performance she remembered from his final years under his father's influence, convinced her to say yes. They left the garden together, walking past guests who parted instinctively to let them through, past Marcus standing rigid near the fountain, past Vanessa, who remained motionless with the ring box still resting untouched on the stone ledge beside her. Neither Daniel nor Amara spoke until they reached the quiet interior of the estate's library, far from the noise and spectacle unfolding behind them. It was there, finally alone, that Daniel asked the question that had been building in him since the moment he first saw her standing near the fountain earlier that evening, the question that had nothing to do with his father, or Vanessa, or the collapse of tonight's celebration at all. He asked her if there was still any part of her willing to let him try to make up for the 5 years his silence, his ambition, and his father's manipulation had stolen from both of them. Amara looked at him for a long moment, one hand resting instinctively over the curve of her stomach, before answering with a quiet honesty neither of them had allowed themselves in years. She told him that she had never stopped loving him, only stopped believing he would ever choose her over the life being built around him. Tonight, for the first time since the divorce, she wasn't sure that belief was still true. The weeks following that night unfolded slower than either of them expected, filled with the kind of quiet, unglamorous conversations that never make it into wedding announcements or engagement photographs. Daniel resigned from his position within his father's company within a month, choosing instead to rebuild a smaller, independent venture, using only the assets he had earned entirely on his own before his father's influence had reshaped his ambitions. Marcus attempted to reach him several times in those early weeks, first through calls, then through mutual associates, then finally through a lengthy letter Daniel read once and chose not to answer. Some decisions, Daniel had come to understand, didn't require a response to be final. Vanessa's engagement to Daniel became public knowledge in exactly the way Marcus had always feared reputational damage would spread. Quickly, thoroughly, and without any version of the story that painted her decisions favorably. She left the city within 2 months, taking a position at a firm in another state, where fewer people recognized her name from the headlines that had circulated after that night. Daniel never spoke publicly about her role in his father's arrangement, choosing instead to let the consequences of her choices unfold privately, without adding fuel to a story that had already cost enough people their dignity. Amara moved back into an apartment 2 blocks from the coffee shop where she and Daniel had first met all those years earlier, a detail neither of them planned, but both quietly recognized as meaningful once she found the listing. Daniel visited every week at first, careful, patient, rebuilding trust, one small gesture at a time, rather than assuming 5 years of hurt could be undone through wealth or grand declarations. He attended every appointment leading up to the birth. He learned, slowly, how to become the kind of partner his younger self had promised to be before ambition and his father's influence had quietly rewritten the terms of that promise without his full awareness. Their son was born 7 months after that engagement celebration collapsed into the very truth it had been designed to bury. Daniel held him for the first time in a hospital room far smaller and far less impressive than any room his family's estate could offer, and he later admitted to friends that it was the first moment in nearly a decade he felt entirely certain he was exactly where he belonged. Amara watched him in that moment and allowed herself, finally, to believe that the man standing in front of her wasn't performing steadiness for an audience, but feeling it, completely, for the first time since his father had taught him that feeling anything too deeply was a weakness he couldn't afford. Daniel and Amara didn't rush back into marriage. They spent the following year rebuilding their relationship on terms neither of their families had ever modeled for them, prioritizing honesty over image and partnership over performance. When they did eventually marry again, in a small ceremony that intentionally excluded any of the spectacle his father once insisted was necessary for a man in his position, Daniel told the handful of guests present that the only legacy worth building was the one built on truth, however unglamorous that truth turned out to be. Marcus wasn't invited. Some bridges, once fully understood for what they cost to build, aren't meant to be rebuilt at all. What this story leaves us with isn't a simple lesson about wealth or betrayal, but a harder question worth sitting with long after the video ends. How many decisions do we assume are entirely our own, when in truth they were shaped quietly by people who benefit most from us never asking who's really pulling the strings behind the choices we believe define us? Daniel spent 5 years grieving a marriage he never actually needed to lose, built on a lie he never had the information to question. Would you have recognized the signs sooner than he did? Or is it only ever clear in hindsight, once the truth finally forces its way into the light? If this story moved you, let us know in the comments what part of Daniel and Amara's journey affected you the most, and whether you believe 5 years of separation could ever truly be repaired the way theirs was.